Right, hello everybody, welcome back again. We're moving on today just to complete topic 4.1, Introduction to Water Systems. And I want in this video to cover the last part, which is human effects on the water cycle. Before I move on, it's worth saying that when we cover this, we're going to focus specifically on the water cycle. So therefore, if you get a question like this in the exam, it's important not to get carried away with talking about effects on water quality. You should constrain yourself to talking about effects on inputs, outputs, flows, and storages. Now, we've already seen of those things on the water cycle, flows and storages have the biggest effect, or the more of them. So therefore, it's easy to talk about the effects in terms of flows and storages. There are three main ways that humans affect the water cycle, and they do that through agriculture, deforestation, and urbanisation. So we'll look at those three things in turn. Right, here's the guide. There are two sentences really only on this topic. First of all, it says we need to discuss how human activities such as agriculture, deforestation, and urbanisation have a significant impact on surface runoff and infiltration. So already it's quite concise with what we'll discuss. And secondly, it says under applications, discuss generally the impact that humans have on the water cycle. Okay, I'm just going to stick to those three things: agriculture, deforestation, and urbanisation. Okay, so for each of those things, I've just chosen some photographs that kind of typify what happens in each case. So in agriculture, here we've got a field, a cultivated field, where the soil has been compacted. Because this is arable farming, it's probably due to farm machinery. In other cases, it might be through trampling of the soil by animals. But the soil has got very squashed and compacted. And the result of that is that you get less infiltration through the soil, and thus percolation through the rock, and you get more increased surface runoff. Basically, the water can't penetrate through the soil anymore. A big result of surface water runoff is loss of soil due to erosion by water. So therefore, it becomes a vicious cycle where you get more and more soil loss and less infiltration. Here you can see an obvious effect that water movement across a field has had on soil erosion, probably due to soil compaction again. On the face of it, this looks like quite a beautiful view here. This is a rice paddy field, terracing fields in Bali, Indonesia, I believe. And I put this here because it's an obvious example of how humans have stopped surface water runoff and turned it into a storage. The water is no longer flowing across the surface, it's staying put for the purposes of rice cultivation. Above here, another interesting photograph. I got this from a publicity shot from a golf course in San Felipe, Baja California, Mexico. And it advertises itself as being a golf course that's almost completely irrigated with seawater rather than fresh water. So this is an example of flow, or outputs and inputs even, being changed in order to bring salt water back onto the land to use as irrigation water. And an effect of that is that they're actually planting salt-tolerant grass species on this golf course, so there's very little biodiversity there. And then finally, here's an example of obvious trampling by animals. I could talk about eutrophication and the effect that the animal poop has on the water itself, but that's moving over, like I said, into water pollution effects, which is getting away from human effects on the water cycle itself. Okay, so very briefly, that's various effects on agriculture, and basically it's limited to effects on surface water flow and effects on infiltration through soil. Okay, deforestation. This first picture here is deforestation of a rainforest in Borneo, I believe, to replace the rainforest with palm oil trees. And you can see the obvious effects that it's had on the soil. The effects of forests largely are, because they got such huge root systems, is to bind the soil together and keep the soil in place, preventing erosion and giving good infiltration again through the soil. We lose that when we deforest. It's worth pointing out as well that deforestation, it might not involve the loss of a whole forest. It could be islandization of the forest, where just parts or islands are lost, but it pretty much has the same effect. This is quite an iconic photograph. This is cattle ranching in the Amazon in Brazil, where the rainforest has been chopped down to make way for pasture for cows. I think we've discussed this before, but rainforest soils, particularly in the Amazon, are very, very infertile. The nutrients themselves are locked up in the plants and in the other living things. So if you take away the forest, you take away the nutrients, and you're left with very thin soils that erode easily and need a lot of fertilizer to keep them fertile. So again, take away the trees, take away the nutrients themselves, and take away the root systems that bind the soil together, and you lose the soil. And here's another example. This is logging in Canada, and you can just see the effect that removing the trees from the slopes has had on the loss of soil. So it's not that different really. You take away the forest, and you take away the infiltration capability of the soil, and you increase surface runoff and cause erosion of the soil. Another vicious cycle. Obviously, if you introduce animals to the land where forest was before, we could go back to the first slide and discuss it in terms of the effects of agriculture on that habitat or biome. Okay, and then finally, urbanisation. You probably recognise these photographs. This is Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, before the arrival of the Spanish, and this is Mexico City today. Basically, the change in Mexico City has involved filling in the lakes and river systems that fed the waterways that were around before the Spanish arrived. The basic effect of urbanisation is to cover soil with impermeable materials like concrete and tarmac. So obviously you do that, you prevent infiltration, and you cause runoff, but it results in very rapid runoff. Basically you get rid of storages and you lose the water very, very quickly. And that's what happened when Mexico City was built up. The Aztecs knew how to live with the water, and the effects of the Spanish colonizers and the people that came after, their interest was getting rid of the water and living without the water. So what's happened in Mexico City is filling in of the lakes and covering of rivers and putting the rivers underground. So now, basically, the rivers of Mexico City are all in channels underground. Sewer systems and the introduction of modern drainage systems mean that we just lose the water very quickly. And instead of having surface water now, we have this water diverted underground. There's been a drive recently by various activist groups to try to reclaim some of the rivers of Mexico City, to try and reclaim them and put them back above ground. That had a lot of traction a few years ago. I remember reading about the newspapers here. But when it became obvious that it was going to be too expensive and it didn't have government support here, so it never really happened, which I think is a great shame. Mexico City, there's a lot of green areas in Mexico City, more than you might imagine, but this is the north area, which is kind of a concrete jungle. And obviously, if you lose green areas, you affect transpiration, evapotranspiration. In fact, something I should have said about deforestation is on a huge scale, on a global scale, if you lose forests, you change the rates of evapotranspiration potentially on a global scale. And then finally, one other thing I thought about, when you get a city like this and you get a lot of building projects going on in a very densely populated city, when you start a building project, possibly one of the first things you do is to dig down into the topsoil and dispose of that topsoil. So not only are we in cities covering over the soil, we're actively moving it from one place to another. So obviously we're having big effects on surface water flow and infiltration that way. And then finally, something we have discussed in a previous video is, where does the water from the city go? Or where does water from various cities go? Well, in the case of Mexico City, the wastewater from Mexico City, a huge proportion of it, is channeled away from the city to the Toluca Valley, where it's used as irrigation water for crops. So that's an example of physically changing the flow of water from a huge area and sending it en masse to another area. Okay, that's about as much as I can think of at the moment. So please watch this and make notes as you go along, and afterwards try to look more carefully, I think, at specific case studies in terms of agriculture, deforestation and urbanisation. I hope that was helpful. Take care, and I will speak to you during our lessons. Okay, bye-bye.